The topic tonight, as you all know, is the global fight against international terrorism. Since September the 11th, all Americans have become deeply aware of the vulnerability of all people in all nations to the weapon of terrorism, and aware of the kind of people who use that weapon and some of the purposes for which they use it. And of course, since that same date, it seems as if the grand parameters of American foreign policy have been reshaped. All of us have a deep interest in the understanding that the United States government has of the phenomenon of terrorism, of the people who use it, and the purposes for which they use it. We're fortunate this evening to be joined by a gentleman who is extraordinarily prepared to talk about those questions and the general approach to the war against terrorism, both by experience and by his current position. Ambassador Black served in the Central Intelligence Agency for 28 years. He received numerous awards. He was director of posts overseas, field management assignments, 6 times, operating throughout his career in the Directorate of Operations. He served in his last assignment was director of the Counterterrorism Center at the CIA, making him the primary advisor to the director of the CIA and the National Intelligence Officer for that subject. And today he serves on the policy side of the bureaucracy at the U.S. Department of State, where he is their coordinator for counterterrorism, an office which has responsibility for the formulation and implementation of American counterterrorism policy. We can expect a deeply informed and perhaps definitive presentation of this, which may be our central foreign policy concern today. Ambassador Black.
Well, thank you very much. I would certainly like to apologize for being so late. In fact, I jumped out of the car and left my wife to park it somewhere. Perhaps she will get here. She is a long-suffering wife, and she's used to things like that. We spent 2.5 hours coming here. That's the transit time from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. The beginning was, I will tell you, very, very slow, and the end was very, very fast. This is actually probably more useful to me than it is to you, because I gained such great insights, oftentimes by the questions that people ask. So I'll leave time for questions. I would like to give a brief presentation, and some of it will talk about the global war on terrorism, but also the role of the Department of State. You know, those of us who watch television, we see the coalition forces in Iraq. We see our troops there, and you hear about acts of the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI, but unheralded very often is the Department of State. So I'd like to discuss a little bit about that. After the terrorist attacks of September 11th, the President adopted a broad strategy to fight back. The initial response in Afghanistan properly was military, but diplomatic efforts were already underway around the world. Today, the international community is fighting a global terrorist threat on 5 fronts: diplomatic, financial, intelligence, law enforcement, and military. All of these fronts are important, but in my view, this will come as a bit of a surprise to many, diplomacy is the prerequisite for success in the other areas and is one of our most potent offensive weapons in the war on terrorism. Diplomacy is the instrument of power that builds political will and strengthens international cooperation. Through diplomatic exchanges, we promote counterterrorism cooperation with friendly nations that serve our mutual interests. We enhance the capabilities of our allies. Diplomacy helps us take the war to the terrorists and to cut off the resources they depend upon to survive. The Department of Justice, Treasury, Homeland Security, Defense, CIA, and many other federal agencies have critical responsibilities in this regard. However, as the lead foreign affairs agency, the Department of State, through my office, serves as the coordinator and overall clearinghouse for counterterrorism activities conducted overseas by the United States government. We are methodically taking the battle against terrorism to the international front lines. Strong embassies and active diplomacy are an important part of the effort. Our ambassadors and staff members of our embassies and consulates draw not just from state but also from other federal agencies and are serving us very well. I have much admiration and respect for the men and women who work at our missions overseas in the face of especially grave threats today. They continue to serve with great professionalism and bravery. Indeed, they are the backbone of our overseas counterterrorism efforts. It is this diplomatic readiness, to use Secretary Powell's phrase, that is vital to our ability to fight terrorism. Our embassies are direct voices to the governments of other nations. They facilitate the disruption of terrorist networks and the apprehension of terrorist suspects. Ambassadors and other members of country teams, including representatives from other agencies, are all instrumental in developing and maintaining good working relations with the host government in pursuing our counterterrorism objectives. It is an important function of my office and staff to support this frontline effort. Since assuming the coordinator's job at the start of this year, I've traveled repeatedly to Russia, China, Japan, the UK, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the tri-border region of South America, Colombia, Austria, Singapore, Cambodia, Vietnam, Greece, and Turkey. And I have just informed my wife that, I will see you later because it will be Brazil, Paraguay, Britain, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Israel, India, and Nepal, and that should take a little over 2 weeks. When you hand in your accountings and you give in your accountings to your secretary, and the best thing about this job is I no longer have to do my own accounting, so for once it's done right, you give your accountings and you see you've been away for a 2-week span. The trick is to count how many hotel bills you have, how many nights did you spend in the bed. And I will tell you, the glamour of the Foreign Service sometimes will lose a little bit of its attractiveness if you don't or can't sleep on airplanes. I can say unequivocally that our chiefs of mission and their country teams are invaluable resources. They are both leading and supporting our efforts to promote our counterterrorism agenda in their respective host countries and regions. Let me talk a little bit about the military. Fighting terrorism militarily is a vital part of the larger global effort. 2 years ago, in response to the al-Qaeda attacks of 9/11, Operation Enduring Freedom was launched in Afghanistan. It was the largest military coalition ever assembled, 90 nations strong, nearly half of the countries of the world. The bulk of Afghan territory was liberated from Taliban control in a matter of weeks. And the Afghan people are now free from the Taliban's oppression. Iraq is now the central front in the war on terrorism. The regime of Saddam Hussein possessed and used weapons of mass destruction, sponsored terrorist groups, paid families of attackers in Israel, and inflicted terror on the Iraqi people. Today, Iraq is no longer a breeding ground for terror. We've captured or killed 43 of the 55 most wanted former Iraqi leaders who are pictured on the famous deck of cards. Despite the death toll of American and coalition soldiers, the war in Iraq has been one of the swiftest and most humane classical military campaigns in history. Saddam's holdouts and foreign terrorists are trying frantically to undermine Iraq's progress and to throw the country into chaos. The coalition forces in Iraq are actively pursuing the terrorists and the thugs that Secretary of State Colin Powell calls dead enders. We are committed to expanding international cooperation in the reconstruction and security of Iraq, and working closely with Iraqi leaders as they prepare to draft a constitution, establish institutions of a civil society, and move towards free elections. I strongly believe that our work now in Iraq is essential to America's own security. This morning I had to testify in both closed session and open session in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the subject was Syria and Iraq. And I think the consensus of the leadership of this country is this is something that the United States must and will resolve positively for the good of the Iraqi people and for the good of us all. Financial. Along with Treasury and others, the State Department is at the forefront of the financial war on terrorism. Secretary Powell has designated 36 foreign terrorist organizations, thus freezing the assets, blocking travel by their members and supporters, and criminalizing material support for them. He has designated 60-plus entities and individuals under Executive Order 13224, freezing their assets and banning U.S. persons from having any transactions with them. There are more than 300 names covered under that executive order, and more persons and groups added regularly. Secretary Powell has also identified 48 groups under the USA Patriot Act, the terrorist exclusion list, keeping their members and supporters out of the United States. Both directly and through our embassies, we're working with governments around the world to attack the mechanisms by which terrorists raise, move, and use money. Each U.S. embassy has identified a terrorism finance coordinating officer to lead the effort to work with the host government to detect, disrupt, and deter terrorist financing. We also help other countries improve their ability to counter terrorism financing. For example, earlier this year, my staff joined an interagency group in Manila to successfully assist the government of the Philippines with enacting financial controls vital to denying terrorists access to funding. In so doing, brought the Philippines into compliance with international anti-money laundering and terrorist financial standards. My office also sponsored the first training course of the newly created Southeast Asian Regional Center for Counterterrorism in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia in August. Anti-money laundering and counterterrorism finance experts from Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, and the United States conducted the basic analysis and suspicious transaction reporting course for 80 participants from 15 Southeast and South Asian countries. This course was aimed at developing financial intelligence analysis ability to detect money laundering and terrorist financing issues. My colleagues in Washington-based interagency teams joining our embassy country teams are helping many other frontline states to evaluate their financial systems, identify vulnerabilities, and develop counterterrorism finance training programs. Intelligence and law enforcement. The gathering of intelligence about al-Qaeda's infrastructure in Afghanistan helped to dismantle or scatter much of its membership and organization. It is not the organization that it was previously. Its capabilities have been sharply degraded. Al-Qaeda is under catastrophic stress. Its leaders worry more about capture than initiating multiple large-scale attacks. Indeed, many members have been caught or killed. We have been making good progress undermining this group. Information gained from captured enemy documents and imprisoned terrorists is being exploited effectively and efficiently around the world. The arrest in February of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the third-ranking al-Qaeda official, was a major coup in terms of degrading al-Qaeda operational capabilities and in the intelligence acquired. In August, police in Thailand captured another key terrorist, Ridul Ismaudin, known as Hambali. He is believed to have been the top representative in Southeast Asia of the al-Qaeda terrorist network. He was the operations chief of Jamaat Islamiyah, a terrorist group committed to establish an extremist Muslim state in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and parts of Thailand and the Philippines. Under Hambali, Jamaat Islamiyah committed many terrorist crimes, including the October 2002 bombings in Bali, Indonesia, that killed some 200 people from more than a dozen countries. The expansion of intelligence sharing and cooperation among nations since 9/11 is preventing attacks. It is saving lives and exposing the hiding places of terrorists. An impressive global dragnet has tightened around al-Qaeda since 9/11. More than 3,400 al-Qaeda operatives and support personnel have been arrested and detained in over 100 countries, largely as a result of the cooperation among law enforcement and intelligence agencies. More than 2/3 of the al-Qaeda leadership that existed at the time of 9/11 have been captured, detained, or killed. Entire cells have been wrapped up in nations such as Singapore, Italy, and here in the United States in Portland, Oregon, and Lackawanna, New York. In these cells, deadly attacks on U.S. interests or our allies were being planned. The State Department is assisting in these fields by delivering training to foreign law enforcement agencies to assist them in strengthening their capacity to deter terrorism. Training in the areas such as hostage negotiation, bomb detection, airport security, border security, criminal prosecutions, and anti-corruption efforts helps to create an environment in which it is increasingly difficult for terrorist groups to operate. In recent years, the Bureau of Diplomatic Security's Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program has developed new courses for countering terrorism financing and defeating cyber terrorism. It has also provided a series of 7 seminars to help other countries strengthen their counterterrorism legislation. The department works with other agencies and U.S. Embassy officers in developing the training package to meet the recipient country's needs. For the coming year, we're scheduling 180 courses for 56 countries. The ultimate success of this global counterterrorism campaign will hinge in large part on 2 factors, and you will be able to watch this play out in your newspapers and on television. This is sustained international political will and effective capacity building. First, we must sustain and enhance the political will of states to fight terrorism. The secret of maintaining a coalition is underscoring to its members every day that the fight is not over, and the sustained effort is clearly in their long-term interests. My meetings with officials from many other governments have convinced me that we have made tremendous progress on that score. You know, I watch television too, and my wife will turn to me when I'm watching the news or talking heads and programs, and she commented to me once, I don't think you can watch television without shaking your head all the time. You have every reason to be confused. When I watch this and I read a lot of this, I get confused too. But in my position, I think I have a pretty good idea of where we are. It is a challenging position that our country is in, but I have every confidence that we are and will do well. We need to enhance the capacity of all states to fight terrorism. The United States cannot alone investigate every lead, arrest every suspect, gather and analyze all the intelligence, effectively sanction every sponsor of terrorism, prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, or find and fight every terrorist cell. When I deal with foreign counterparts, there's never the allegation of the United States going it alone or being arrogant in its isolation and thinking that it can carry these international burdens on its own. Victory, in my view, against terrorism is assured. How long this will take is uncertain. The President has said this is a war of uncertain duration. The casualties and losses between now and victory are also undetermined. but it will be calibrated in terms of the relationships we have with foreign countries, the cooperation that we enjoy with foreign countries, and the commonality of addressing this international scourge in an efficient manner. What the State Department does is, in my view, arguably the most important. We essentially, through our relationships with foreign countries, enable the military, law enforcement, intelligence, financial experts to do their work efficiently and productively. And we will either, the community of nations, we will either succeed together or we will not. It will not be the act of an individual state. The President's national strategy for combating terrorism involves the State Department's leaderships at many levels. To defeat the threat of terrorism, we must make use of every tool in our arsenal, particularly diplomacy. Diplomacy makes it possible for us to effectively use all the other instruments: military power, law enforcement, intelligence, and vigorous efforts to cut off terrorist financing. The war against international terrorism is a global enterprise of uncertain duration. The United States will help nations that need our assistance in combating terror and will hold to account nations that sponsor the use of terror and harbor its perpetrators. You will be cut no slack. We will cooperate with other nations to detect, deter, and destroy terrorist organizations at every turn. The gravest danger our nation faces is a combination of radicalism and technology. Our enemies have openly declared that they are seeking weapons of mass destruction, mass murder, and evidence indicates that they are doing so with determination. Therefore, we will act against such threats before they are fully formed. We are mindful that no nation can build a safer world alone. Alliances and multilateral institutions can multiply the strength of freedom-loving nations, building the will to strengthen and effectively use international alliances and institutions to overcome the scourge of terrorism is what we do at the Department of State, of which I'm very proud, and I would be happy to attempt to answer some of your questions. I promise you I'll answer them honestly. If I don't answer you, that's because I can't. There's an aspect of security involved, but I'm particularly interested in your questions and see what your impressions are of where we are and where we're going. Thanks very much.
I apologize, Mr. Ambassador, but just before you came, I told the audience that I would ask you whether it would be all right if we continued for 15 minutes beyond when we usually do. I didn't intend to ask you that question in front of 300 witnesses, but if it would be congenial for you to prolong the program until 7:25 instead of 7:10, that would be appreciated, I know, by everybody.
I'd be happy to do that, and again, thank you very much for waiting.
Thank you
Please.
so much. Let me ask you one other thing, Mr. Ambassador. If you do call upon somebody who is not at a microphone, and there are 2 microphones, if you would repeat their question for the benefit of our camera, that would be helpful as well.
And I will attempt not to change the question to something I know. Yes, ma'am.
Nita Nachmias from Towson University. The European Commission recently reversed its policy to freeze the assets of Hamas in Europe. Not because Hamas was declared a non-terrorist organization, but because it was acknowledged that they are providing essential social services. Are we doing something about it? Can we do something about it? The second question, do you think that the Patriot Act went too far in abridging civil rights? Thank you.
The question, the first one was Hamas. The European Union had decided that contributions to Hamas, since these contributions contain contributions for humanitarian reasons that they would no longer, in the European context, be carried as a foreign terrorist organization. Is that correct, essentially? Okay. We disagree. We work with our European partners to underscore the fact that there are many ways to contribute to worthwhile charitable causes. The Palestinian people have charities that are acknowledged as being free from terrorism. The Hamas organization, yes, there are good works that are done. There are also killers. And as the position of the United States that contributions that are intended for the Palestinian people go to those charities that have been validated to conduct only good works, we encourage that. It is our belief that since a proportion of funds that are contributed to Hamas are used to support terrorists and used for operational purposes, we oppose that, and we will continue to encourage not only our European partners, but all the countries of the world to accept our perspective on this. I'd also say, as a former practitioner of counterterrorism, law enforcement personnel and operations officers of intelligence agencies are not accountants. And it is decidedly inefficient to review the books of a complex organization like Hamas, if one had access to it, to identify the whatever percentage is being used for terrorism. It is inefficient, it is wasteful, and there is another means to achieve the same end, which is contribute your monies to charities that are validated by the international community that do only good works. So for efficiency purposes, people that don't want to do that, we consider Hamas a terrorist organization. We carry it as one of our official foreign terrorist organizations. The Patriot Act, I think that my opinion really doesn't matter. I think practically, from the standpoint, is that from what I know of the Patriot Act and my experience with it, this personally causes me no concern whatsoever. I labored in the vineyard before the Patriot Act, and it was tough going because there was such a bias away from effective collection and preemption of likely terrorist activities. I think the Patriot Act is reflective of a need that this country requires. Not to have this would seriously inhibit the ability of law enforcement to do its work in protecting the people. So personally, from my standpoint, I have no problem with it at all. Do I value and do I see a future for CIA paramilitary capability? Is that correct? Okay. Now I can become a diplomat. Listen to this. My answer to that is yes. Next question. Yes, sir.
Two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, since 9/11, on the basis of data that you've collected with your background, have we had a more and an increasing number of either terrorist incidents or people being affected by it? That's question one. In other words, is it going down or is it going up? Secondly, what consideration has been given to the situations where terrorism is basically incited, sometimes by governments? In other words, we're talking about a terrorist, but for an example, the U.S. has been opposed for years to the policy of settlements in Israel. These settlements are inciting many more terrorists. How do you balance one against the other? And of course, you have this land grab. I understand Ariel, which is one of the new communities, is in the middle of the Gaza Strip. So the fence has to go right across the middle to protect Ariel. Now this is the Palestinians consider it a land grab, a lot of other countries consider it a land grab. Personally, I thought a fence would be a good idea, but it's usually when you have it on your side of the property. Thank you.
Okay, those are a lot of different issues. I mean, just to go on the fence, in my view, that's more politics than counterterrorism. It's the position of the United States that we don't believe that a fence is appropriate at this time because it's walling in and walling out various communities. That issue is being engaged the diplomatic level among the Palestinians, the Israelis, and certainly the United States expresses its view, which I have done. In terms of numbers of terrorist incidents, we put out a publication every year called The Patterns of Global Terrorism. The most recent one was from 2002. The number of terrorist incidents went down something like 38%. Most of that had to do with attacks on oil pipelines in Colombia. I don't have the statistics for this year so far. It depends also how you count. If you eliminate the counting of events in Iraq that were in a warfighting sense, that would have a significant impact. I would say that we are in an intense period. We have regular acts of terrorism in Iraq, which are being addressed and resolved. I would say that terrorists increasingly attempt to go for high-order, very important type attacks. I mean, if you take it to an extreme, something like a 9/11. Their objective is to do that. However, because of the pressure that they are under around the world, the relentless 24-hour day of pressure, essentially from all the police and security services around the world, that their tendency has been to take the expedient way out and go for simpler, less sophisticated type attacks that can use operatives that have a lower level of training.
This has to do with the United States. Since the American taxpayers are the ones who seem to be footing the bill for this police force against terrorism, I haven't seen much change here in the United States, and I'm speaking as a member of the American Border Patrol, on patrolling our borders. We presently have 8 million foreigners residing illegally in the country. Nobody knows who they are or cares where they are. Presently in Maryland, there's a push to give them driver's licenses, which, as you know, is how the terrorists got onto the planes on September 11th. Why is there so little being done in the United States to stop this invasion of illegal aliens coming into our country?
Okay, I do counterterrorism, not alien affairs, but I will tell you that the Department of Homeland Security has taken the point in terms of looking at the terrorist threat coming in. We have established new networking, computers, new criteria that make it increasingly difficult for foreigners that have evil intent to come in here. The Secretary of State has stated, I think, very succinctly and very clearly that we want people to come to the United States. We are a land of immigrants, but we want people who have the intent to hurt us to keep them out. So essentially, his approach to this is, open door policy, but secure borders.
What about the law? What about immigration law?
Well,
They just come in and break our law?
Well, I mean, there are laws against illegal immigration. If you're talking about the enforcement, I'm not going to address that as a foreign policy specialist. I think that there is considerable movement across our borders, that it is difficult to patrol borders, it is difficult to interdict. I can remember at 9/11 when we were very deeply concerned about the follow-on attacks. And frankly, like many Americans, looking at the map, I probably hadn't paid as much attention to the geography of the border area between the United States and Canada. And I can remember being in the Situation Room. We had immigration specialists come in. It is not an accident that it's called the longest undefended border in the world. In fact, there are a small number of classical crossing points. There are other, and they have a name for this, but it's they place an orange cone in the road with a sign that if you're crossing after hours to go back, but if you wish to cross between 9 and 5 o'clock, you have to go to the next station down the road where there's a person. These are things being addressed. The balance is one of protecting the American people against terrorists, while at the same time facilitating the normal interaction and communication and travels of people going back and forth. Yes, ma'am.
Why hasn't the United States made it a priority trying to solve the Palestinian problem? I mean, everything else is more important. This, to me, is one of the causes for terrorism. We are antagonizing our Arab friends. And the United States just plays lip service when Sharon, as this gentleman said, when they built this fence and they infringed on the West Bank and this occupation of the Palestinians, and the United States just does nothing. I want to know, why hasn't President Bush put this on the plate as his first priority, and then take care of Iraq? But I think that this is one of the reasons why we have terrorism.
Thank you very much for that question. Essentially, we're referring to the Middle East peace process, and I would ask you to think of a country other than the United States that has done more, spent more time in airplanes, spent more time interacting with both parties than the United States of America, from administration to administration. I don't think that's the case, ma'am. The Secretary of State has been interacting regularly with both parties. His Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, Mr. Burns, regularly is interacting with both. The answer to your question is, if it were easy, it would have been done a long time ago. You have both parties that are very set in their ways and their perceptions. There's blame to go around on all sides. There's nothing easy about this, but I will assure you that I think this country can take pride in the energy and the effort that it has exerted to try and develop an equitable solution between the two. Yes, sir.
The September 11th was our Pearl Harbor in terms of an enemy making an attack on American soil and hitting it very, very hard. That was brought about by Osama bin Laden and people who were against the Saudi regime in Saudi Arabia and their collusion and working with Western governments, the United States. And it was not because of other matters, but because of, in that situation, they weren't satisfied with the kind of government and ruling in their own country, in Saudi Arabia, and how they wanted to set up an Islamic state in Afghanistan with a certain concept. Mm-hmm. We have Al Jazeera and networks on cable in the Arab world, promoting incitement in some cases. What are we doing in the propaganda war in the Arab world of trying to get them to see a peaceful, cooperative effort with the West?
It's an excellent question. This is something that's being looked at increasingly. Margaret Tutwiler has come back from Rabat, Morocco, who will be the undersecretary essentially charged with trying to get the message out. This is a real issue that we have to come to grips with. You have, in many countries, a class of people that do not have opportunity, that do not have access to education and health care, who are basically downtrodden, and who view the United States as part of their problem. I will tell you, many of the countries that I go to, third world countries, I'm not going to say which ones, but I will go to them, and we'll come in, remember, your will help you to build your capacity, and the litany of things that need to be done, all of which the Americans are meant to do for them, is something that the United States cannot sustain. It is our intent to encourage leadership of every country, to encourage moderation, to stand up and speak for it. I think the radicals have surged ahead. I think the solution is not necessarily Madison Fifth Avenue slick advertising. People are pretty smart. I think we have to come to them with the beef, and the beef is the truth of what we do and the objectives that we have. and we have to do a better job of working with foreign governments to get this story across. And it is one of the significant issues of our time. And I'll tell you why I'm personally interested in this, because my job is essentially, remember I told you before, diplomacy is important. Fine. We want foreign agencies to work with our counterparts here. So you go to the head of state or some senior official in the country, and you say, listen, we want your law enforcement to work with the FBI and their terrorists here and the like. He'll go, geez, I'd really like to help you, but look at the polls in my country. And the polls may be skewed against that type of cooperation. So I think that is something that will need to be really looked at hard, and it'll have to be a sustainable program for the long term. We have a good message, we have a good product, we have to do a lot better job of getting it out.
Thank you.
Sir.
Last year, I was talking to a Saudi student, and he said something very, very important. He says, in his country, is the Saudi family are riding a tiger that they created, and they have to, in a sense, are paying, quote, ransom to the imams or whatever. They're sending money overseas to schools that are radical. I wouldn't say they're the standard Islam, but it's a radical form of Islamic. Mm-hmm. And they're supporting them, and to, in a sense, in some ways, to try and have stability within Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. And the second question I want to bring up is this, is that I agree with you 100%. You've got to do diplomacy. When you kill someone in a war, and I've known this, is that when you kill someone in a war, another soldier, they have children, and they grow up and they remember who killed their father. They might be the enemy to us, but then those children become our enemies too.
I would like to adopt your answer for the second question. I think it's right on the mark and very profound. In terms of Saudi Arabia, since January of last year, I have been one of the U.S. government officials has been traveling regularly to Saudi Arabia to deal with senior Saudi officials. And I've had to testify in front of committees, whereas I'm no expert on Saudi Arabia, my shtick is counterterrorism. This I know. In dealing with them, I would submit to you, essentially I will tell you what I have told the Senate and the Congress. And that is that, there was a before 9/11, and we can look at inconsistencies. We can look at challenges that the Saudis failed to address or resolve. And after 9/11, there was a fundamental change. They started to do their best. They started to appreciate the situation that they were in. And after the May attacks in Riyadh, I think they all too readily recognized, hopefully not too late, the challenges in their own society. The good news is they're giving it a lot more than they ever did. I was almost moved to say they're giving it all they've got, but no one ever really does that. But I will tell you, in all honesty, and some people may like it or some people may not, you read the New Yorker about how blame everything on the Saudis and all that. That's not true. The reality is that they are hitting it on all cylinders now, certainly in contrast to the past. That's the good news. The bad news is they have a very significant and large problem. So what are they doing about it? They have arrested, detained, and killed a large number of al-Qaeda terrorists in their own country. I can't tell you the number because it comes from intelligence, but it's a lot. And they're going at it full tilt because these people are in their own society, not only killing Americans, but killing Saudi citizens. They have lost their own policemen and soldiers in this fight. The last count was something like 13 of their young men that are dead in a common cause with us. They have, as an example, outlawed charitable contributions at the mosques where you put in coins and money. I'm Catholic, you go in the back, there's a church box. They've cut that out because they can't track the monies. And the last check around, we couldn't find any in Riyadh. They've held up to their word. they have declared that every charitable institution that wishes to give money to a foreign cause can only have one bank account. That one bank account is so that auditors can efficiently and effectively audit the books, make sure that the money goes where it's meant to. The lady at the beginning who was talking about Hamas, that's what we're talking about. The United States is all for money going for good works. We are all against money going to terrorists. The mullahs in mosques. I've lived overseas. I can recall mullahs announcing to the assembled, Cofer black, he should have his head cut off and we should drink his blood. I kind of take exception to that. So I'd go up to the guy and I'd say, so what up with this? And he'd go, it's just flowery language. In most of the instances, that's absolutely the case. However, in Saudi Arabia, what they're doing now is they're vetting all the mullahs in the mosques. If you're talking anti-Semitism, if you're talking violence, if you're supporting terrorism, you're out of a job. So they're vetting their people. These are big changes, folks, in a place where the women look like black blobs and they can't drive their own cars. This is a very, very conservative society. And they're coming awfully far, awfully fast for them. I told them, if you do good, I will stand up for you. And if you do bad, I will be the first one to name you and shame you. And I got to tell you, folks, in a short period of time, they're doing real good.
But try, like I said, the second part is this country has always tried diplomacy first and tried very, very hard, right from Teddy Roosevelt on and things like that.
Yeah, I'm really gratified that you appreciate that. Not too many people think of diplomacy in the global war on terrorism, but I would submit to you, having been a career intelligence officer, we have our bit, and when it's a case of extremists and there's a threat and it has to be resolved, the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, that's the crowd you go to. But in general, as a global phenomenon, it is diplomacy that is really the best weapon we have in this, getting on with kindred spirits and resolving a common enemy.
At the beginning of your remarks this evening, you mentioned testifying this afternoon before a Senate committee on the subjects of Iraq and Syria.
Yes, sir.
And I'm wondering what the outlook is within our relations with Syria toward getting them to be a little more helpful in the war on terrorism.
Yeah, okay. Syria is a state sponsor of terrorism. We don't cut them any slack either. There was a brief interlude after 9/11 where we did receive useful information from the Syrians. They have to do a better job of closing down terrorist offices in Syria. You have the entire spectrum. It's sort of like a terrorist Epcot center. You've got Hezbollah, you've got Hamas, you've got PFLP-GC, you've got the whole lot of them. They have training camps. They move in and out. There is insufficient control. We require control. We require they shut these camps down. We require that they shut their offices down. The Syrian government would have us believe they're just, media outlets. I know from my former life, to hell they are. They conduct operations through there. They pass money. We want them shut down. We're going to cut them no slack. This is what we expect. We also expect them to enhance their controls on the border with Iraq. We want them to not only to enhance their patrollings, we also expect them to preempt and identify terrorists that are attempting to infiltrate across the border, whose objective is to kill coalition troops. We expect we expect them to cease their support for Hamas, particularly the Islamic Jihad organization inside Hamas, to stop the funding, to stop providing training, to get out of the terrorism business. And practically, the interesting part about it is, if you look at it just in terms of Syrian interests, there is a phrase, wooden-headedness, where people relentlessly do the same thing that is destructive and harmful. Their economy is decaying, their trade is insufficient to keep them going, they're harming themselves, they need to be reintegrated into the international community. The way to do that, they've got to, smell the coffee, get into this century, and stop support for terrorism.
Is that what our leverage is? Promoting those ideas?
Well, that is our leverage, and also our leverage is to repeat, as I am to you here in the international community, we repeat this over to other states. We encourage the Europeans to adopt the same policies we have towards Syria. There is nothing to compensate for the support for terrorism. And the other thing, people use this word terrorism and it gets kind of confused. Well, you know, freedom fighter, terrorist, insurrection. You know, there's a really, I have a, you know, if you want to know the real definition of the State Department, I've got a book, I can get it out for you. But you know, it's a thing that's common to man. It's very simply those who would kill innocent men, women, and children for a cockamamie political objective. And that's the business that we're in. You know, I'm not in the insurgency business, I'm in the counterterrorism business. And it doesn't matter whether you're from the Shining Path, the IRA, PLO, PFLGC, Red Brigade, you're all my enemy. Are we getting useful information out of the Iraqi leaders that we have arrested or detained? The answer to that is yes, we are. The second question is that, you know, we all really want to capture Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. If you look at Saddam Hussein's current situation, he's probably in the area of eastern Afghanistan, western Pakistan. He operates in a pretty secure way. He moves with only very few people. He's able so far to keep in contact with individuals that share his same crazy ideology. We have come close before. We have arrested and resolved the vast majority of his associates. And, you know, he will be caught too, no question about it. It's just a matter of time. It could be tonight, it could be tomorrow, it could be next week. Like I say, he's a goner. Saddam Hussein. This man had an infrastructure of loyalists that were in place before the war began. He's using them up. I would submit to you that the coalition has been able to resolve many of these. His two sons, Uday and Qusay, you may recall, were caught. It is simply a matter of time before he is caught and brought to justice.
I have a specific question. Maybe you can enlighten us. There's a hospital on the in Jerusalem called Augustana Victorian. It's a Lutheran hospital, and that hospital allowed anyone to come to the hospital and be treated, whether it was Palestinian, Israeli, or anyone. They were doing well until the Israeli government took away their tax-free status, which really made a dent in their ability to do their work. Now, as I understand, there are some diplomatic moves to try and resolve the situation. I was wondering if you could give us some background and maybe where we are on that.
Well, sir, I have to admit you have me there. I've been to Jerusalem many times, but I don't know this particular hospital.
It's up on the Mount of Olives.
Yeah, I don't know it. The way you've described the situation, my expectation would be the United States would object, but I don't know the hospital. I don't know the facts. It would be prudent for me not to comment. But in a situation like that, the way you've described it hypothetically, I feel very sure that the United States would go to the Israelis and say, we don't agree. We think it should be open. It's a reflection of our society and how we see things. Israel is a sovereign state, you know, and you know, diplomacy is the act of is persuasion. It's not a command-control relationship.
Where is all this money coming from that's financing the terrorists, and what are we doing to track down and hopefully dry up those resources?
172 countries have identified and frozen $136 million that were associated with terrorists. The State Department establishes financial intelligence units. As I indicated earlier in my brief, we spent a lot of time working with foreign countries to change their laws so that they can blend with the laws of other countries so we can track the money. The President of the United States is one of the strongest proponents of draining the swamp, as he describes it, which is to take money away from terrorists. We actively look for their holdings, how they move money, and interdict it. In the past, I would say that we were inhibited because the terrorists learned how to blend and commingle funds with good works. I'm always comes back to the lady with the Hamas question. You know, this is no accident. You know, they take terrorist money and they blend it with things that look quite benign and hide it. We're getting better and better at identifying monies that are to be moved to terrorists. But I will say it is difficult. But the effort being devoted in this is almost historic.
President Bush promised the American people that we'd have swift justice when we caught the terrorists. I don't seem to ever hear anything about what happens. You talked about the deck of cards. I don't know how many of those. I think they caught 45 of them, but they don't say whether they're dead, or they keep everything secret, like what's happening in Guantanamo. All I hear every day is how many American soldiers are killed, and I don't go for the Vietnam body counts. Yeah. But justice should be swift. And they shouldn't get all this stuff that we get in this country. A murderer lives for 15 years after he goes to court. So I never hear anything. You said you'd like to know what people wonder about.
Well, that's very useful.
I think somebody ought to give a scorecard, not just Rumsfeld stuff and all that kind of stuff. How many did you kill?
Sir, you're doing a great imitation of the President of the United States. That's exactly what it gives me all the time. You know, where are the numbers, where are the scores? You know, I think it's the baseball thing, tell you the truth.
Right.
Let me tell you, swift justice, we're all for that. And there's no one more in favor of that than President of the United States. But to underscore this lady's question, are we getting any useful information out of detainees, people who have been kidnapped and arrested? My answer is yes. And that's a part of swift justice, too. The question is, do we have to worry about the issue of weapons of mass destruction in the hands of terrorists? It's a personal thing of mine. I always like to say that I am concerned, I'm not worried. Small thing. Yeah, we are concerned about it. The reason for it is terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and a whole lot of these guys. We have good information on this. You know, they are trying very hard to collect the material and to gain the expertise to have such a capability. And we're deeply concerned any group that's hostile to freedom-loving men and women that show every evidence of going full tilt as hard as they can to get the materials, to get the expertise, to put it together. You know, we're doing well, but you always have a problem because you have to get everyone. Yes, it is a concern. We're on top of it. I think we're doing well. I think we have a pretty good idea of where these programs are and where they're going. But in the world of counterterrorism, you know, you are short of being paranoid because you can never have 100% certainty that you know everything.
For an evening that I think is very helpful and certainly encouraging.
Thank you all very much. God bless you.